When 17-year-old Sophia Martinez stepped onto the Family Feud stage, she hadn't spoken a word in her entire life. But what happened when she answered a question about strength, using only her hands, would teach an entire studio audience that the most powerful voices don't always make sound. Sophia moved with the confident grace of someone who had spent years commanding attention without ever saying a word. As captain of Lincoln High School's cheerleading squad, she had learned to communicate through movement, expression, and a sign language so fluid and expressive that her teammates often forgot she couldn't speak aloud. Her hands moved constantly as she walked, not with nervous energy, but with the purposeful gestures of someone for whom movement was language, for whom every finger position and facial expression carried meaning that was more precise than most people achieved with thousands of words. The Martinez family had made the journey from Phoenix, Arizona, with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. There was Elena Martinez, 45, a high school Spanish teacher who had learned sign language before Sophia was even born, determined that her daughter's mutism would never limit her ability to communicate. Her husband, Roberto, 48, a construction foreman who had surprised everyone by becoming fluent in ASL and incorporating it into his work sites to communicate with deaf workers. Their older son, Miguel, 20, home from college where he was studying deaf education, had grown up as Sophia's primary interpreter, but had learned over the years to step back and let his sister's personality shine through on its own. And their youngest, Isabella, 14, who could switch between spoken English, Spanish, and sign language so seamlessly that she often translated for multiple people in the same conversation without missing a beat. But it was Sophia herself who commanded attention, not despite her inability to speak, but because of the extraordinary way she had learned to express herself. Her sign language was poetry in motion, her facial expressions more communicative than most people's entire vocabularies, her presence so commanding that rooms fell silent when she entered, waiting to see what she would say with her hands. Sophia had been born with congenital mutism, a rare condition that left her vocal cords underdeveloped and unable to produce sound. But her hearing was perfect, her intelligence exceptional, and her determination to live fully had led her to become one of the most popular and respected students at Lincoln High. As captain of the cheerleading squad, she had revolutionized the way the team communicated. Their routines incorporated sign language so beautifully that hearing audiences often found themselves mesmerized by performances that told stories through movement. Sophia had taught her entire squad basic ASL, creating a team dynamic where silent communication during games gave them advantages other squads couldn't match. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Isabella's suggestion, but it had taken months of planning. How would a game show accommodate someone who couldn't speak? Would the producers understand that Sophia's silence didn't mean she couldn't participate fully? Would Steve Harvey know how to interact with someone whose primary language was visual rather than auditory? The show's producers had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure Sophia felt welcomed and respected. They had provided an ASL interpreter, modified the podium to ensure cameras could capture her signing, and briefed Steve extensively on basic sign language etiquette. Look at the person signing, not the interpreter, speak directly to her, understand that her responses might take a moment longer, but would be worth waiting for. Steve Harvey had been immediately struck by Sophia during rehearsal. There was something magnetic about her presence, the way she communicated complex ideas through gesture and expression that seemed more articulate than most verbal communication he encountered. When he had approached her during family introductions, she had surprised him by fingerspelling his name, Steve, and then signing something that made her entire family laugh. What did she say? Steve had asked Elena. She said you have kind eyes and asked if you know any sign language. Elena had translated with obvious pride. Steve had admitted he didn't, and Sophia had immediately begun teaching him the sign for hello, a simple wave that became more formal and respectful in her hands. When Steve had attempted to copy her gesture, she had given him an encouraging thumbs up and the kind of brilliant smile that needed no translation. The game had progressed through 3 rounds with Sophia contributing thoughtful answers through Elena's interpretation. When asked to name something that makes you smile, Sophia had signed a response that Alina translated as watching people understand each other, earning the #1 answer on the board and enthusiastic celebration from her family. But it was during the fourth round that everything changed. The question was deeply personal. Name something that gives you strength. The competing family had just missed their opportunity to control the board, and it was the Martinez family's chance to steal. Roberto had given the first answer, family, which had earned a solid spot. Miguel had followed with faith, another respectable response. Now it was Sophia's turn. She stepped forward to the podium, and for a moment she was still not uncertain but gathering her thoughts, preparing to express something complex and deeply personal through the movement of her hands. When she began to sign, her movements were more deliberate and emotional than anything she had communicated during the game. Her hands moved with the fluidity of someone speaking from the heart, her facial expressions conveying layers of meaning that transcended individual words. Elena began to translate, but paused as Sophia continued signing, clearly moved by what her daughter was expressing. She says, Elena began, her voice thick with emotion, my voice that nobody hears but everybody feels. The words hung in the air with a weight that seemed to silence the entire studio. But Sophia wasn't finished. She continued signing, her movements becoming more passionate, more expressive. Elena wiped her eyes before continuing the translation. She says that being mute taught her that real strength doesn't come from making noise. It comes from making people feel understood, making them feel heard, making them feel like they matter, even when you can't make a sound. The studio fell completely silent, not the polite waiting silence of a game show audience, but the profound quiet of people who had just heard or seen something that challenged everything they thought they knew about communication, strength, and what it means to have a voice. Steve Harvey had interviewed thousands of contestants, had heard every possible variation of human experience. But something about Sophia's answer, delivered through graceful movements and translated through her mother's loving words, stopped him completely. Sophia, Steve said gently, looking directly at her rather than at Elena, that's not just an answer, that's wisdom. Sophia smiled and signed something quickly to Elena. She says thank you, and she wants you to know that you make people feel heard too. Even people who communicate differently, Elena translated. Steve was quiet for a moment, processing not just what Sophia had said but how she had said it. The grace, the confidence, the obvious depth of thought behind her response. Can I ask you something, Sophia? Steve said, maintaining eye contact with her. And please, take your time answering however feels right for you. Sophia nodded, her hands poised and ready to respond. How do you lead a cheerleading squad without being able to shout commands or call out encouragement? Steve asked. Sophia's face lit up with obvious excitement at the question. She began signing rapidly, her movements becoming more animated as she explained something she was clearly passionate about. Elena translated as Sophia continued. She says that cheerleading isn't really about shouting anyway. It's about energy, timing, and making people believe in something bigger than themselves. She says her team learned to communicate through eye contact, hand signals, and movement patterns that are actually more precise than verbal commands. Sophia paused her signing to pull something from her pocket. A small laminated card covered with hand-drawn symbols and gestures. She created this communication system for her squad. Elena continued translating as Sophia held up the card. Each gesture means something specific, different formations, timing changes, encouragement signals. She says her team can have entire conversations during games without making any sound, which gives them advantages other squads don't have. Steve looked at this remarkable young woman who had turned what others might see as a limitation into a revolutionary advantage, who had found ways to lead that were more effective than traditional methods. Sophia, Steve said, you just taught me something about leadership that I never understood before. Real leaders don't just talk to people, they find ways to connect with people, to understand them, to make them feel like they're part of something important. Sophia signed something quickly, and Elena translated with a smile. She says you already knew that. That's why people love watching your show. You make families feel important. You make their stories matter. Steve was moved by the compliment, but more than that, He was inspired by this teenager who had found such powerful ways to communicate appreciation, wisdom, and leadership without ever making a sound. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. "Sophia," Steve said, "I want to try something, if you're okay with it. I want to learn some of your language." He approached her at the podium and asked, "Can you teach me how to say 'I hear you' in sign language?" Sophia's face lit up with delight. She began demonstrating the signs slowly and clearly, pointing to her eye for "I," cupping her ear for "hear," and pointing to Steve for "you." Steve attempted to copy her movements, and while his signing was obviously amateur, the intent was clear. When he completed the phrase, Sophia gave him an enthusiastic round of applause, not polite encouragement, but genuine appreciation for his effort to communicate in her language. "I hear you," Steve said aloud while signing, looking directly at Sophia. "I hear your strength. I hear your wisdom. I hear your voice, even though it doesn't make sound." Sophia responded by signing something that brought tears to Elena's eyes. "She says," Elena began, her voice breaking with emotion. "She says that you just gave her the greatest gift anyone has ever given her. You learned her language just to tell her that you hear her." The studio audience began to react, not with typical game show applause, but with something deeper, recognition of a moment when two people had connected across different ways of communicating, when understanding had been achieved not through shared language but through shared respect. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached over to his podium and picked up his microphone, the tool of his trade, the instrument through which he had built his career and connected with millions of people. "Sophia," Steve said, walking back to her with the microphone in his hands, "this has been my voice for 40 years. It's how I've talked to America, how I've shared stories, how I've tried to make people laugh and feel understood." He held the microphone out to her in a gesture that was both symbolic and practical. "But today, I learned that a voice doesn't have to make sound to be powerful. Your voice, through your hands, through your expressions, through the way you lead your team and love your family, is more powerful than any microphone." He placed the microphone gently in Sophia's hands. "This is your microphone now. Not because you need it to have a voice, but because I want everyone to remember that real communication happens when people care enough to understand each other, no matter how different their languages might be." Sophia accepted the microphone with ceremony, understanding the symbolic weight of the gesture. She held it for a moment, then did something unexpected. She began to sign while holding the microphone as if delivering a speech to the studio audience. Elena translated as Sophia continued. "She says she wants everyone to know that being different isn't about being less than anyone else. It's about finding new ways to be exactly who you're meant to be." She says that not having a voice taught her that actions speak louder than words, that love speaks louder than anything, and that when people take the time to understand each other, everyone's voice becomes stronger. The studio erupted in sustained applause, but this time it included something unique. Dozens of audience members were clapping with their hands raised above their heads, having learned from watching Sophia that this was the deaf-mute community's way of showing appreciation. Steve looked around the studio, seeing people who had been touched not just by Sophia's story, but by her wisdom, her grace, her refusal to be defined by what she couldn't do, rather than celebrated for what she could do extraordinarily well. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "Sophia Martinez just taught all of us something about communication, about strength, and about what it really means to have a voice in this world." As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something remarkable happened. Person after person approached Sophia, not to express pity or amazement at her condition, but to thank her for teaching them something valuable. Parents of children with disabilities shared their own stories. Teachers talked about incorporating visual communication into their classrooms. Young people gained new appreciation for the many ways humans can connect with each other. One elderly deaf woman approached with tears in her eyes, signing rapidly to Sophia. Elena translated. She says that Sophia reminded her that being deaf or mute isn't a disability. It's a different ability. She says watching Sophia lead with such confidence gave her hope for her own granddaughter who was born deaf. 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened. with closed captioning that included descriptions of Sophia's signing and subtitles for all spoken dialogue. The response was unprecedented. Schools across the country began incorporating basic sign language into their curricula. Cheerleading squads adopted Sophia's silent communication techniques. The episode became a teaching tool for diversity and inclusion programs, showing how differences in communication can become strengths rather than barriers. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the deaf and mute community itself. Sophia became a role model for young people who had been told they couldn't participate fully in hearing society, proving that leadership, communication, and influence have nothing to do with the ability to make sound. Sophia went on to college with a full scholarship, studying communications and deaf education. She kept Steve's microphone as a reminder of the day when someone had recognized that her voice was valuable, not despite its silence, but because of the powerful ways she had learned to express herself. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that meeting Sophia changed his understanding of communication and leadership. She taught me that the most important conversations happen when people care enough to learn each other's languages, he said. Real communication isn't about talking, it's about connecting. The microphone became a symbol in Sophia's life, representing not the voice she didn't have, but the voice she had created through determination, grace, and the refusal to let others' definitions limit her own potential. She used it in speaking engagements, where she would sign while someone else spoke her words, showing audiences that powerful messages can be delivered in multiple ways simultaneously. Isabella went on to become a professional ASL interpreter, inspired by watching her sister's impact on others. Miguel specialized in deaf education, working to create more inclusive educational environments. The entire Martinez family became advocates for deaf and mute awareness, using their experience to help other families navigate similar challenges. The lesson that day wasn't about overcoming disability or inspiring others through adversity. It was about recognizing that human communication takes infinite forms, all of them valid, all of them valuable. Sophia had shown an entire studio audience that strength comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from finding authentic ways to express who you are and what you believe. Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most profound moments in television happen when you stop talking and start listening, not just with your ears but with your eyes, your heart, your willingness to learn new ways of understanding the remarkable people who enter your life. And Sophia Martinez proved that having a voice has nothing to do with making sound, and everything to do with having something valuable to say and the courage to say it in whatever way feels true to who you are.